they were selfish or they just wouldn't listen to you or whatever. I don't know, have y'all experienced that? It's hard to find good leaders. We need to try and develop that in people and to encourage them to continue doing what they're doing. And then they had a list of characteristics: integrity, delegation, communication, self-awareness, gratitude, learning agility, influence, and empathy. Somebody who cares. Having integrity. This one guy I worked with, he had no integrity. And the people just did not like working with him. You couldn't believe anything the guy said. And in my line of business, that was kind of critical. So, wait, are you telling me the truth now or not? Communication. Boy, that's a huge one that came up on a lot of people's lists as I'm doing some research about what they consider good characteristics. Able to communicate and let us know. Most of the problems we have are because of poor communication. Isn't that right, hon? All right. So, Kirk Brothers, this is the qualities or the characteristics that he listed in his book. Now, next week we're going to talk about spiritual leadership, and then we'll get into centered, connected, compassionate, common, clear thinking, competent, courageously calm, coaching. He had 2 chapters on coaching, and then character. And so he had them all start with C he thought that would help you remember what we're going to tell you. So we're going to change the page and see how many you remember. But we'll spend a week talking about each of these, how Jesus looked at those things. Well, let's look at Jesus. What kind of education did he have?
Formal?
None.
Read, right?
I'm sorry?
Jesus could probably read, right?
Yes, I would assume so. From what I read, a first century Jewish boy, at the age of 5, they were sent to the synagogue school, and they learned to read and write at the synagogue school. Sorry, girls, only the guys were sent. The girls had to learn from their mothers or other females at home. So from age 5 to age 10, they learned to read, write. At age 10, they started focusing on the law. And they only studied the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. And so they would focus on the law, and from that, they would study the law and what were the other 2 topics they said? Ethics. I'm drawing a blank. It'll come to me after class. So anyway, that was by the time they would complete that from age 10 to 18, they're studying just the law. And by the time they got to 18, your school's over. Or it's probably over before you got to age 18. So that was just his common Jewish boy's life. What about the wealth? Was Jesus known for his wealth? No. What kind of a sacrifice did the parents have to make when he was born? 2 doves. Yeah, rather than a lamb, they sacrificed 2 doves when he was born. So they couldn't afford the lamb. So that tells quite a bit about their lifestyle. Certainly not a prominent family. Well, what about his political power? Well, he never held an office, didn't run for an office. It's amazing to look at him and the way he was brought up, but yet everybody knew who he was. That's just incredible, amazing to me. Military might. He didn't have an army. He didn't have chariots, men with swords and shields and people that are going to fight for him. Just wasn't the way he was. A palace. The foxes have their dens, the birds of the air have their nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. His hometown. Can anything good come out of Nazareth. Anyone from Galilee was despised. So, sorry, Jeff, they're like Texans. Let's look at the parable of the sower. Oh, man, sorry, you can't read that right for me. And when a great crowd was gathering, and people from town after town came to him, he said in a parable, a sower went out to sow his seed, and he sowed. Some fell along the path and was trampled underfoot, and the birds of the air devoured it. And some fell on the rock, and it grew and it withered away because it had no moisture. And some fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up with it and choked it. And some fell into good soil and grew and yielded 100-fold. As he said these things, he called out, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Hopefully you can read this. Okay, so in the book, Brothers had a quote from Keener, and he said, the majority of the Roman Empire were peasant farmers or herders. The illiterate elite ignored this large population, but Jesus uses illustration that this class understands. Most of the inhabitants of Galilee were rural agrarian peasants. So most of them were poor farmers. And yet he's talking about sowing seed. And these people are understanding. They can relate to what he's doing because that's their livelihood. They knew exactly what he was talking about. And then he said, some of it yielded 100-fold. If somebody came to you and said, hey, I've got an investment idea for you, and it's gonna make 100-fold, you'd probably want to call your broker and say, hey, buy this for me. I asked Kirby Edmondson, I went and picked his brain. I said, okay, a farmer buys a bushel of wheat for seed, and he goes out and plants that wheat. What kind of a windfall does he expect from that? How much wheat is he going to get back from planting a bushel of wheat? And he said, well, first of all, they sow their seed by weight. So 100 pounds per acre. So a little over 1.5 bushels that they use to sow 1 acre of ground. I'm getting a nod here.
Yeah, that's correct.
And then so from that acre they get how much?
40 to 100 bushel.
Oh, he told me about 30.
He's not a good farmer.
Oh.
I have farmers in Canadian County that pull 70 bushel out of the field.
Wow. He said, and he told me, he said, if you're getting 60, he said, your fields are irrigated. So 60 to 70, wow, that's a pretty good return. That's a really good
Well, the
return.
county average would be probably like 45 to 50, but there are farmers that can produce 70.
Wow. Well, from what I read, the average in Judea, was 10-fold. Of course, they aren't using the modernized equipment, and they're just out there just throwing the seed, and so it's the way they scatter the seed. Or they said they would load a bag of seed onto an animal, an ox or a donkey, and poke a hole in it and just let the donkey walk through they lead it through the field and just let it drop the grain in rows, kind of something like today. Let's see, I got a couple of words here to look at. So where he says, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. This akuin and akuito, that's a root word. It comes from, it didn't come up. So those are both root words that comes from akuo, meaning to hear. But the word that's underlined, the second word that Jesus used when he said, he that has ears to hear, let him hear. Well, that second let him hear word is actually a word that is a third person imperative. It's a command. that he is telling them. And so the Net Bible translates it this way. But other seed fell on good soil and grew, and it produced 100 times as much grain. As he said this, he called out, "The one who has ears to hear had better listen." He'd better listen. We as students had better listen. Now, why do you think Jesus said after that parable that some of the seed is going to produce 100-fold? Are you listening to me? You better listen. It's something important. He goes on to explain what the parable of the sower was. What is the seed? The Word. So God's Word, if we let it grow in us, it's going to produce 100-fold. It's capable of producing 100-fold. Takeaways from this parable. Jesus spoke the cultural language of his audience. Of course, he was from Nazareth. He could relate to them. He could talk to them on their level, in their dialect. He tells them stories that they can relate to. He had several other parables, and in Matthew he goes on not only to explain the parable, then he tells the parable of the tares and how they, we may read that later. I'll not bore you with it yet. His audience understood his message. They knew what he's saying. It's interesting that in Luke 22, Luke talks about the Pharisees sending spies to act like believers to find out what the message is that Jesus has. And when he's explaining the parable of the sower, he said, they see, but they can't see. They hear, but they don't hear. They don't understand. And so, they go back to the Pharisees, and can you imagine that? Well, what did he say? Well, he was talking about sowing seeds. And they didn't catch the message that Jesus was trying to say. Our society here in Oklahoma is less agricultural than it used to be. You may agree or disagree. Yeah, so much of it is mechanical now that they don't need the hands that they had to have previously. We lean more towards technology. The largest industry in Oklahoma is aviation and aerospace. Not over here. Yep. And then somewhere in there, there's going to be oil and gas, and so we have to dig a little deeper in order to get the understanding. What is he saying? What is he trying to tell us here? A Galilean farm, and a lot of this is quoted from Keener that brothers had quoted in the book. He said the soil may or may not have been plowed. And then I found this, the image got cut off, sorry. But an ancient Egyptian image of him plowing with this, and originally they would use a hard wood was what they would use to plow with, and it was being drawn by an animal. But even in the Old Testament, they had metal plows. Jumping ahead of myself. Deuteronomy 22:10, you must not plow with an ox and a donkey harnessed together. That was something that Moses wrote back then. Why do you think he said that? It was funny reading some of the commentaries about that, and they said, well, it had to do with the superstition. And no, they don't get along. It's best if you have 2 ox or 2 donkeys or something that's going to work together. Thought I saw a hand. Paul said, using that same illustration, 2 Corinthians 6:14, not to be unequally yoked with unbelievers. The weeds may or may not have been removed. The writer said that most likely they were probably just cut off and burned. Cut off at ground level. Left the roots there, just cut it off. Well, what's going to happen? Yeah, it's going to resprout and regrow that weed. And so the weeds grow right back up with the seed and it chokes out the wheat. So then, the parable of the tares. Let's just look at that. Matthew 13, 24 to 30. Whoops, I'm in Jeremiah. So he answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But she came and bowed down before him. I'm in the wrong chapter. Sorry. Try this again. Matthew 13, 24 to 30. He presented them with another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a person who sowed good seed in his field, but while everyone was sleeping, the enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the plants sprouted and bore grain, then the weeds also appeared. So the slaves of the owner came and said to him, Sir, didn't you sow good seed in the field? Then where did the weeds come from? He said, An enemy has done this. So the slaves replied, Do you want us to go and gather them? But he said, No, since in gathering the weeds you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At harvest time, I will tell the reapers, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, and then gather the wheat into my barn. So that's probably where he got that idea, that they were just cut off and bundled and ready to burn, going to burn the weeds, and just wait for it later. He also said that much of the Bible land only had about 2 inches of soil. That varies quite a bit. They said below that top soil would just be rock, but it varies quite a bit. They have some very lush valleys that had rich dirt. They had lots of places that looked like Arizona. So, Oklahoma claims that 1 out of every 8 jobs is related to agriculture. I thought, that seems like quite a few. They must be counting every cashier at Brahms or something. All right, spiritual soil. And this was right out of the book. This is what Brothers said. The road soil. Spiritual leaders are willing to learn. Am I? They're adaptable. They're willing to try new things, accept new things. Have to be flexible. The rocky soil. Spiritual leaders have strong faith and finish what they start. Do I? There's so many farming illustrations in the New Testament talking about no one who puts their hand to the plow and then looks back is worthy. How do you plow a straight line? Yeah, you pick a point in the distance, even beyond your field, and that's what you're driving to, is that point. So you have a nice straight row. But if you're looking where the tires are doing this, your row is going to look like that.
Now it's all GPS, so you don't even
look. Yeah, it's automated, and you just start the tractor and let it go. Yeah. I have a cousin in southeastern Oklahoma, and he had his little son, like 5, 6 years old, out there driving the tractor, and a friend drove by and looked over, and he didn't see anybody in the cab of the tractor. He thought, oh no, he thought the tractor had gotten loose or something, and he turned around and came back, and no, it was his son driving the tractor. The thorny soil. Spiritual leaders put heavenly things before earthly. Will I? putting first things first. And finally, the good soil. Spiritual leaders have humble, open hearts that listen and learn. Will I? He talked about the reason he's writing this book is to teach us leadership so that we can do what we do better, so that we can improve ourselves and improve those around us and help to lead others. At the end of this chapter, I didn't make a slide for it. He put a challenge out there to write down a list of excuses why you're not going to finish reading this book. It was challenging. It was very thought-provoking, and I enjoyed the book, and I look forward to this study. And like I said, next week we're going to be talking about spiritual leadership. I finished plenty early. Y'all have any questions?
You talk about the difference in societies. I mean, nowadays, one farmer feeds 155 people, according to USDA.
Yeah.
And, back then, unless you were one of the elites, you probably grew the food you ate. And
Right.
If you didn't, and you can even go back to the days of World War II and Victory Gardens. People had to grow what they ate, so there was a closer connection to agriculture than there is today. And it's, like I say, it's kind of a lost art.
They saw that when they went to Russia, and a retired doctor that thought he had things set for life and had had resources stored up, and then due to the fall and the devaluation of their money, and they're having to grow turnips in their flower beds to survive. So
You can learn, when you're hungry, you can learn agriculture real quick.
Yes.
Thinking about Jesus, as far as, up through age 30, I was felt that he was probably a carpenter.
Mm-hmm.
But yet, when it came time to teach people, he recognized his audience and knew that they were probably going to be farmers, and so he did give a lot of parables, and not necessarily about carpentry, but knowing the audience, he gave parables about agriculture.
Yeah.
And stuff.
When he's talking to rich people and he's talking about money things.
That's very important as far as being a leader, I think, is knowing and recognizing your audience.
Yeah.
Even the salt, of the earth. When he talks about when salt loses its savor, you put it on a path. You don't go out and put it and dispose of it on good soil. He knew enough that they made their paths in the fields off of the salt that was lost its savor.
Yeah. And it was interesting, a lot of that I read. I mean, as Americans, and I don't know, I don't think this is just the way I was raised. I just think it's our culture that thinks this way, that, a farmer has a field out there. You don't go walking through the field and picking his fruit, his grain, and eating it as you're passing through, as you're trespassing on his property. But that was an accepted thing in the Bible and in Bible times, in the Bible land, that there was a certain amount of your produce that you expected that people are going to just be passing by, and they're going to stop and eat some of your figs off of your tree. So, and they weren't worried about paying for it, I don't think.
I think it was important that he talked to the common people about common subjects. And you're exactly right that all of this in that first century dealt with just the simplicity of what it's all about. And I think that as we look at these parables, they weren't just spoken to be spoken. There was reason behind what the Pharisees, so the political leaders, the religious leaders of the time, were trying to do to the word that he was spreading. And I think it reminds me of that passage that you had up there from 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 14, not be bound together with unbelievers. I don't think that means, I'm saying I think too much. I don't think that it's telling us that we can't talk with folks about God. I think that we have too many instances in our own culture today where we have tried to become close with denominationalism, or that we have become very, very friendly with people. He goes on down through there, verse 16 and so forth, so you just can't do this. Would Christ have made, although he was out there with the tax collectors, the sinners, but he had that power to overcome so much of that, whereas he knows we need to be careful about some of that.
Yeah. If you become friends with the world, and you have to be careful not to accept their worldly ways, and it's easy to be distracted, drawn away, deterred. I'm sitting here and I had several thoughts running through my head. The Greek words that I was talking about, the akouê, our English word acoustic comes from that, because another form of that word is acousticos. And so acoustics, to hear. Left that one off. Something else will come to me here in a minute.
It's an interesting challenge too when we're talking about handling what we're speaking to. Like if we're leading a group of people, listening to them to be able to tailor what we're saying to accommodate their needs, whatever we've done. It's kind of interesting in my daily life. I work with people from all kinds of cultures, right?
Mm-hmm.
It really takes a lot to listen to and understand, where people are coming from in the first place, in order to really reach out to them. But yeah, that's just commonplace in our workplace now. Is that, so.
And having to try and relate a message to them.
Yeah.
I mean, they're like, when they're from different cultures like that, and understanding why they do what they do, and things that we do that might offend them and we don't even realize it. Taking your shoes off when you walk in someone's house. So this first thing that came to mind, but there's a lot of things like that that would offend other people. We just barge in. Oh, sorry. That's why you didn't invite me over. Anything else? Okay. Y'all are going to get a 10-minute break. Be back next week. I'll try to be more prepared. Yeah. Well, let's have a word of prayer before we go. Oh, sorry. Dear God, thank you so much for this wonderful evening that we've had to study part of your word. Father, help us to go out and be better leaders. Be with the Dill family and the Sheets family. Comfort them as they go through this time of sorrow. And be with Angela and the doctors ministering to her. We pray that things will go well, that they'll make the right decisions. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.